On a freezing winter night, a wealthy CEO sat in his warm car outside the city's glittering skyline. Lost in his own loneliness, just a few blocks away, under the dim light of a bus stop, a young nurse clutched her shivering baby, trying to shield the child from the bitter cold. Passersby glanced, then looked away, unwilling to get involved. But when the CEO's eyes met hers, something shifted. He didn't know her story, her struggles, or her pain, but what happened next would leave an entire city talking and challenge the meaning of humanity itself. The CEO, Daniel Whitmore, was no stranger to success. His name appeared in glossy magazines. His company's headquarters stood tall in the city's skyline. And yet, beneath the surface of wealth, he carried a loneliness that money could never fill. Friends envied his life, but Daniel often left charity galas and high-powered meetings only to return to an empty penthouse. His world was polished, controlled, and distant. Meanwhile, across the same city, Emilia, a nurse barely in her mid-20s, struggled in silence. She had been working double shifts at a local hospital just to provide for her newborn son. Bills piled high, and with no family to support her, she had learned to live on very little. On that particular night, with the last bus delayed and temperatures dropping dangerously, she wrapped her thin coat around her baby and prayed for dawn to come quickly. The contrast between their worlds could not have been sharper. One man surrounded by luxury, yet isolated. One woman surrounded by hardship, yet clinging fiercely to love for her child. Neither knew the other existed, but fate was already moving quietly, setting the stage for an encounter that would shake both of their lives to the core. And so, as Daniel's car slowed near the bus stop, his gaze fell upon a figure hunched against the icy wind. What he saw would make him question everything he thought he knew about kindness, privilege, and the invisible walls society builds between people. The sight at the bus stop was impossible to ignore. A young woman sat on the cold metal bench, her shoulders trembling beneath a coat far too thin for the biting night air. In her arms, a small bundle squirmed, letting out soft cries muffled by layers of worn blankets. Daniel slowed his car instinctively, his eyes catching on her pale face illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlight. He recognized exhaustion immediately, the kind that doesn't just come from a long day, but from years of carrying too much weight alone. Emily tried to appear strong, adjusting the blanket around her baby with trembling hands. But the truth was clear. She was shivering, her lips pressed tight against the chill, her eyes darting nervously at the passing cars that didn't stop. The world had taught her that people rarely noticed, and even more rarely cared. Daniel's first impulse was hesitation. He had been warned all his life about crossing lines, about keeping a safe distance from other people's problems. It was easier, after all, to remain untouched in his protected bubble of wealth. Yet something about this woman and the fragile life in her arms pulled at a part of him he hadn't felt in years, part buried under contracts, boardrooms, and appearances. The injustice of it all hit him in a way statistics and news articles never could. Here was a nurse, someone who spent her days caring for strangers, saving lives that others took for granted, left abandoned at a bus stop in the freezing cold with her own child. Society celebrated people like him, but ignored people like her. The imbalance was glaring. Emily noticed his car slowing, her heartbeat quickening with both fear and hope. Too many times she had been overlooked or dismissed because of her appearance, clothes too simple, accent too plain, and skin tone that made her the subject of subtle discrimination at her workplace. Even as a nurse, she had endured condescension from patients and supervisors alike, often being mistaken for an assistant or cleaning staff rather than a trained professional. Now, sitting at the bus stop with her baby, she feared that same invisible bias would make this stranger drive past without a second thought. But Daniel didn't drive past. Something within him refused to let the scene blur into the night like every other passerby had allowed. His loneliness, his wealth, His reputation, all of it, felt meaningless in that moment compared to the reality of a mother, clinging to her child in the freezing dark. When he finally pulled over, 1,000 thoughts rushed through him. What would people say if they saw him, the untouchable CEO, stepping out to help a stranger? Would they accuse him of weakness, of being reckless? Would Emily even trust him? Yet, despite all the doubts, he opened his car door. For Emily, it was a moment suspended in uncertainty. Her instinct was to shield her baby tighter, bracing herself for another act of indifference or worse, judgment. But what came next would challenge both of their worlds and set in motion a story neither could have predicted. The cold air hit Daniel's face as he stepped out of the warmth of his car. Each step toward the bus stop felt heavier, as if he were crossing an invisible boundary he had never dared to before. Emily looked up sharply, her eyes wide with mistrust. She clutched her baby closer, as though bracing for rejection disguised as pity. Daniel stopped a few feet away, not wanting to frighten her. For a brief, charged moment, their worlds collided in silence, the gleaming watch on his wrist catching the dim light, the frayed blanket around her child barely holding warmth. Two lives that should never have crossed, yet here they were, drawn together by something neither of them fully understood. Emily's mind raced with past humiliations. She remembered patients questioning if she was qualified, enough colleagues whispering about her background, landlords who turned her away once they realized she was a single mother. This stranger, dressed in wealth, represented everything that had dismissed her existence. And yet, something in his eyes was different, soft, hesitant, almost human in a way she rarely saw in those who lived his kind of life. Daniel, for his part, felt his heart hammer in his chest. He had built a career on making ruthless decisions, on never showing weakness. But here, looking at the shivering nurse and the fragile infant in her arms, he felt an ache he could not bury. He remembered his late wife, the loneliness that had consumed him since, and the son he lost too young. The echoes of that grief made Emily's suffering unbearable to watch. The baby let out a small, pained cry, snapping both of them out of their silent standoff. It pierced Daniel's chest like a blade. Without thinking, his voice, gentle, uncertain, cut through the night. Not with condescension, not with pity, but with something startlingly human. And in that moment, the barrier between wealth and struggle, power and vulnerability, began to crack. A choice hung in the air, heavy and life-altering: to walk away and let the night swallow them separately, or to step closer and change the course of all. 3 lives forever. Daniel inhaled deeply, as though steadying himself for a decision he had never rehearsed. He stretched out his hand, hesitant but firm, and whispered to words that would change the night. "Come with me." For a moment, Emily froze. Every instinct screamed caution. Life had taught her not to trust to a zillion, especially men who looked like him. Men with polished shoes and expensive coats, who rarely saw women like her as human. Yet the raw sincerity in his voice silenced her doubts. The trembling baby whimpered again, its tiny body shaking against the frayed fabric of her blanket. Emily glanced down, then back up at him. She realized this wasn't about her pride anymore, was about survival. As Daniel led her to his car, whispers began to rise from the nearby bus shelter. A few passengers watched with narrowed eyes, some sneering at the sight of a powerful man reaching for a woman who looked worn down by life. Their stares carried that familiar sting of judgment, as though she were undeserving of rescue. Emily felt the heat of shame prickle her skin. But Daniel's steady hand reminded her that for once, someone wasn't turning away. The warmth of his car enveloped them. Emily clutched her baby tighter, not knowing what to expect. Daniel drove silently, his mind racing through memories of his own late wife's struggles when she was ill, of the loneliness that still haunted him. Tonight wasn't charity, was redemption. a second chance at being the man he once wished he could be. When they arrived at his estate, the contrast nearly stole Emily's breath. The vast home stood like a fortress of everything she never had. She braced herself for humiliation, expecting him to change his mind once the reality of who she was sank in. But instead, Daniel opened the door and said softly, "You're safe here." The hours that followed unfolded with quiet grace. A doctor was called, warm clothes were offered, and for the first time in months, Emily laid her baby down on clean sheets. She wept silently, overwhelmed not by pity, but by the dignity she was finally shown. Word of Daniel's act spread quickly. Some criticized him, others praised him, but for Emily, the only truth that mattered was the night a stranger chose kindness over indifference. The bond formed at that bus stop grew stronger in the days to come, not as savior and victim, but as equals, bound by shared humanity. And so, the story leaves us with a question. In a world divided by wealth, power, and prejudice, how often do we pause long enough to see the person shivering in the cold, holding on to hope? Perhaps the true measure of success isn't what we build for ourselves, but the lives we choose to live when no one else dares to stop.